The Merkel era is drawing to a close, and after 16 years in government, Angela Merkel will finally get a long-awaited rest.
Und dann werde ich vielleicht versuchen, was zu lesen, dann werden mir die Augen zufallen, weil ich müde bin, und dann werde ich ein bisschen schlafen und dann schauen wir mal, wo ich auftauche.
At the end of September, Germany voted.
This is DW News, and these are our top stories. Germany's center-left Social Democrats say they have a mandate to govern after winning a narrow victory in the country's parliamentary elections.
The SPD was elected the strongest party with 25%. So soon, it's tschüss to Angela Merkel and hello to new Chancellor. Not so fast. As with most things in Germany, there can be a long process before a new Chancellor is elected. And this time, it's as much about the frontrunners for the Chancellery as it is about the kingmakers from possible coalition parties.
So who will be the next Chancellor, and what happens to Germany after Merkel?
For Merkel to leave the stage entirely, there first needs to be a new government.
So what does happen to Merkel and the outgoing parliament in the meantime? Some of the most important answers are in here. According to Germany's Grundgesetz or constitution, the Bundestag, Germany's parliament, must convene for its first session no later than 30 days after the election.
The previous members of parliament, including Merkel, remain in the Bundestag until the first session. That also marks the end of the Chancellor's term in office. But even then, Merkel won't be clocking out of the Chancellery straight away. At the request of the German president, currently Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the outgoing Chancellor is obliged to continue government affairs until their successor is elected. Caretaker governments generally don't make any far-reaching decisions.
But the coming weeks will be dominated by parties negotiating a new coalition government. But the clock is ticking. So who will be Merkel's successor? Isn't that what Germans just voted for? Nope. The German Chancellor isn't directly elected by the people. Voters vote for parties, who will then be represented in the new Bundestag. A stable government will require the support of a parliamentary majority.
Usually, the new Chancellor is the candidate from the strongest party, but that isn't always the case. This time, the choice could be between the SPD's Olaf Scholz and maybe even the CDU's Armin Laschet. That decision ultimately lies in the hands of two parties that will be coalition kingmakers, the climate-friendly Greens and the business-focused FDP.
But how is a coalition formed? First, it all kicks off with Sondierungsgespräche, literally probing talks between parties. Only if the chemistry is right will some parties go into Koalitionsgespräche, or coalition talks.
Two coalitions look most likely.
One option is the traffic light coalition, with red for the Social Democrats, who got the most votes, yellow for the business-friendly Free Democrats, and green for, well, the Greens.
While the SPD and Greens could get along quite harmoniously, getting the Free Democrats on board could be trickier. The FDP opposes the SPD and Greens' plans to tax the wealthier and wants to stick to Germany's strict balanced budget rules.
Which brings us to the second option, a Conservative-led coalition, also with the Greens and FDP. It's known as a Jamaica coalition due to the party's colours.
It's no secret that the FDP would much rather be in a Jamaica coalition than a traffic light combo. In a Jamaica scenario, it's the Greens who would be harder to convince, particularly when it comes to meeting Germany's climate goals. The Greens also want to see more public spending than the CDU, CSU and FDP. But on the sidelines, bilateral talks between the Greens and FDP have already started. Ultimately, it's these kingmakers who will influence who becomes Merkel's successor.
So forming a coalition will require a lot of compromise, and every party will be fighting for their own interests. But what happens when talks collapse?
Well, that's exactly what happened in 2017 after the last federal election. FDP leader Christian Lindner left talks with the Conservatives and Greens because he wasn't satisfied with the compromise on the table.
Es ist besser, nicht zu regieren, als falsch zu regieren. Auf Wiedersehen.
After almost 6 months of toing and froing, politics in Germany were at a near standstill. And after all that, Germany still ended up with another grand coalition with the Conservatives and SPD, the same as in the previous term. That was the last thing many voters wanted then and now.
If talks really hit a wall, a minority government is possible, but that's always been avoided in the interest of stability. And if there's one thing Germany loves, it's stability.
The absolute last resort would be fresh elections. But that's highly unlikely. And there you have it. There could be some long nights, weeks, if not months ahead. The only thing we can be sure of, it will be a man sitting in the Chancellery. If talks drag on and Merkel stays in office till mid-December, she'll become Germany's longest-serving Chancellor.
And when she does leave, it will mark the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, most likely with more parties represented in government. And that means even more negotiations and compromise in German politics in the future.